to the season-ending bonus episode of You're All Doomed, the podcast that has slogged its way through Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Vancouver in 13-minute chunks. I'm Greg.
And I'm the little boy laying in the tunnel, Brian.
And this is the episode where we kind of talk about our thoughts of the movie as a whole. Brian, what did you think of this?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I have pretty mixed feelings about it. As a Friday the 13th movie, I think it's probably my least favorite so far. And I say that because even though Part 7 kind of went off the rails with Tina and her, crazy powers, this is the first Friday the 13th movie so far that didn't feel like a Friday the 13th movie. It just felt like, and I alluded to this in the previous episode, it just felt like an action movie where Jason was the main character. We've seen this downward trend where characters matter less and less, and the focus has been put more on Jason. And I just don't know if that makes for an interesting movie. And there's plenty of issues with this movie, believe me, but just as a whole, I just don't think it really works as a Friday the 13th movie, because the things that I like about Friday the 13th, which is something that's kind of scary, something that's kind of relatable, this movie doesn't have any of those things. It's just kill after kill after kill. And frankly, most of the kills weren't even all that interesting. And I just feel like it was a huge missed opportunity.
I can't argue with anything you just said. There's a big obvious complaint that's easy to make about this movie, but my real complaint fundamentally is that this movie at no point is ever scary, nor do I ever get the sense that it's even really trying to be, other than a few surprises and jump scares. But it's never creepy. It's never spooky or unsettling, other than like unintentionally, as when, Charles is tackled on the bed by Tamara and doesn't fight her off quickly enough. You're absolutely right when you say it doesn't feel like a Friday the 13th movie. Obviously, the biggest complaint that can be leveled against this movie is that almost none of it takes place in Manhattan, let alone the fact that they barely even filmed any of it in New York. It all had to be filmed in Vancouver. I tried to watch it this time with the understanding that that's not the director's fault. He was given the mandate. He's the one who came up with the idea of Jason going to a city, which is a great idea, or at least a potentially fun idea. Whether or not it would make for a scary movie is one thing, but it's I can't argue with that as a great idea for a marketing hook, if nothing else. And it's not his fault that the studio gave him virtually no money to work with. And I blame the studio for making, promoting, and releasing a movie called Jason Takes Manhattan, but not giving the filmmakers the resources to actually fulfill that promise. So I tried to watch this movie with a more charitable eye of, with the resources they have, was it at least entertaining? And there were some things you pointed out in our discussion that I hadn't caught that were pretty nifty. Some camera tricks that were cool. It's a sense where I get the sense that everybody involved gave this movie their best shot. Everybody was excited to be working on it. Nobody phoned it in. I think some of their decisions were very misguided. And I think that ultimately it's a failure based on what I was hoping for. But I have to confess, I had more fun watching this movie this time than I was expecting. I was dreading this one, and I wound up kind of having a good time. And that's ultimately what I would want from a Friday the 13th movie. It's not the type of good time I would have wanted, but I still had a good time. And could I have done better? I can't say I could have, not with the restrictions that they had placed on them.
I think that's all fair, especially you talked about the restrictions. I mean, I think the original outline of the movie was the first third took place on the ship, and then the second 2/3, or the next 2/3 took place in the city, and then budget restraints and just logistical issues basically flipped that. And not only did they have challenges shooting on the ship, they had challenges shooting in the city, whether it was Vancouver or New York, wherever they were. And so they did the best that they could, but it just wasn't enough. Like, if you view this movie as just like a standalone entity, then it's fine. It's entertaining. As a Friday the 13th movie, I have huge problems with it because primarily the ending. But it's the reason I think it's more disappointing than it is a bad movie, because there was so many missed opportunities. Like, they could have done something cool on a boat. You take the little elements of this movie, like, hey, they're on a boat for a while and they're in the city for a while. That's cool. You can do some fun things with both of those environments, but I just don't think they were allowed to. The boat, prevented them from doing it. There was all this talk about how, the interior of the boat and the exterior of the boat were two different things. So that's why you don't really see a lot of the exterior of the boat. And, the city is its own problem, but there's so many just things that they could have done to make it good. So it's more frustrating because it's like, oh, they could have done something better with a ship. And like, I don't have anything off the top of my head, but there's like so many fun things you could have done on a ship or in a city that they just didn't do.
Yeah, I mean, the basic concept of putting Jason in a new environment is not an inherently bad idea. I think you have to be careful about the kind of environment you place him in, but I think that there's absolutely potential in putting him in a new environment. We've seen 7 movies of him at camp, and I'm not opposed to trying something new. The idea of Jason Takes Manhattan is so cartoony and ridiculous that I loved it when I saw that trailer for the first time. And it could have been better than it turned out. I'm not opposed to the idea of Jason on a boat for a whole movie. I mean, they could have maybe saved the New York money and put it toward boat money and just had a whole movie of Jason on a boat, and it could have been cool. I think they wound up having to make 2 different movies with the budget of maybe half a real movie. So yeah, it's a shame. It's a missed opportunity. I would love to see the studio come back now and maybe make a new version of this with some real money behind it, where he actually is in fucking Manhattan for the whole time.
Well, I tried to think of some movies that did take their primary character out of a familiar setting and put him in a different place. And of course, I thought of the Crocodile Dundee movies. No. Actually, what I thought of was Predator 2, because there was a lot of parallels there. You've got this creature, monster, whatever you want to call it, that was in the woods/jungle, and then you take him out and you put him in the city. And for all intents and purposes, Predator 2 works. It's definitely goofier than the original, but they went all in. They're like, we're going to put the Predator in the city, and we're going to take advantage of all the things that he can do here. You put him on a subway car, and he goes fucking ballistic on the subway car for a really cool scene. You get a subway scene with Jason in New York City, and he walks past everybody, and he doesn't do anything. And then he gets off the subway before he goes to do something else. And so it's like, oh, you're so close. You had all these opportunities to do something. I don't care if it was filmed in Vancouver or New York. It doesn't matter. You can still set, urban, environments and have Jason do cool things with it. And the subway was just the first thing that came to mind.
I mean, yeah, and frankly, the one element, like, they could have done one thing and it would have saved this movie. Put Gary Busey in it.
Lions, tigers, Jason, oh my. You mentioned how you would like to see, like a remake where he actually is in New York City. What are some landmarks where you'd like him to show up, or how would you like him to use his environment better than Jason Takes Manhattan did?
Again, to be fair, these are all things that, as far as I know, Rob Hedden could have absolutely conceived of these things, and he just wasn't able to do them. So it's not like these are such brilliant ideas that no one else has ever thought of them. But, the first ones that pop in my head almost immediately is I'd love to see more of Jason doing something with height. We only saw him on one rooftop fighting Julius, and that paid off very, very well, very strongly. But I mean, you're in a city that has incredibly tall buildings, and Jason could throw people off them. Jason could be thrown off one himself. There's a lot of opportunities there that you don't have at Camp Crystal Lake for height-based violence. I would have loved to see him do something with a hot dog cart. They talk about all this, toxic sludge under the city. What about hot dog water? I mean, that's the most terrifying thing ever. But I think, my favorite idea that I thought of, other than, Jason getting impaled on the spire of the Chrysler building or something, is it'd be great if they had a 10-minute sequence, tops, of Jason chasing somebody in Central Park. So it would be back in the woods. It would be just like all the other ones, but it's in New York City.
That would have been a great way to open the remake of Jason Takes Manhattan, is Jason chasing someone in the woods, and you're like, oh, cool, we're back in the woods, and then you pull back and you see that you're in Central Park.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah, I also think you could use the city as a disadvantage to Jason. So rather than Jason using the city as a tool, as far as we can tell, this is the first time that Jason's ever been away from Camp Crystal Lake. He died at Camp Crystal Lake as a child, and he's been doing all of his killings there. So this should be foreign surroundings to him, and he should be seeing this hustle and bustle, and it should be disorienting, and he doesn't know what to do. But he knows how to get on a subway and how to operate turnstiles. And it's like, where did he learn all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want Jason to be too much a fish out of water, because then you veer into making him a sympathetic character.
Then you get Crocodile Dundee too.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, you're right. It'd be great if he was chasing someone across the street and he's running against the light, so he gets hit by a panel truck or something. That would be great.
Let's say they greenlight a remake of Jason Takes Manhattan. Would you want to see a remake of the first 2/3 of this movie where it's, Jason on a ship of some sort?
I would rather they split it into, do a remake of Jason Takes Manhattan. If you want to do, Jason Cruise Control, where that's him getting to New York and it ends with him getting to New York, and then the next movie is all in New York, I'm all for that. If Jason was on a full-size cruise ship with, hundreds of people, and, glitzy, it'd be fun to see Jason in a glitzy environment, with fancy tablecloths and, Disney princesses running in terror from him and stuff. That'd be kind of fun.
Taking out a bunch of people during a magic show.
Right. I think that we missed a good opportunity for somebody to get pummeled by an anchor. There's all sorts of stuff on a ship that could be used against the human body in amusing ways. So I wouldn't want them to remake this movie with this structure. I would want it to make a movie with Jason on a boat. That's fine. I'll go see it. Make a movie with Jason in the city the whole time. That's fine. I'll go see it. Don't tell me you're making one thing and then show me something else.
Right. That's why I think they, even if the best intentions were that this was going to be a movie where Jason spends primarily the entire time in New York City, I think once it was established that wasn't going to happen, they should have just changed the title. Yeah. And again, go back to the idea of, hey, he's on a ship for most of the time, and then surprise, they show up at New York City at the end.
Right.
Then you wouldn't have been disappointed. It just would have been a great surprise. Holy shit, they end up in New York City. That's pretty funny. And you wouldn't have really cared about what it looked like or how little they utilized it, because that wasn't the premise of the movie. It was just Friday the 13th Part 8, whatever it was called. But if you're going to say Jason Takes Manhattan, then God damn it, he better take Manhattan.
Mm-hmm. So what did you think of Rennie and Sean as characters? We've had 8 movies now of people battling and surviving Jason. What did you think of them?
Well, I think of Rennie frequently. But no, as a character, Rennie was fine. I don't really understand what her character arc was. Okay, so she had some traumatic experience at a lake when she was a child, and then she's going to try to squash this fear by going on a giant ship. I don't really see the two things being related. I'm sure there's plenty of people that are afraid of water that don't go on ships, but I think being on a giant boat is a lot different than being in a tiny rowboat on a lake. So it just, she could have very easily hung out on this boat and just never gone near the railings, and she theoretically would have never really noticed that she was out in the water. I mean, most of it took place at night anyway. So the motives of her going on the cruise were a little strange and didn't really add a whole lot to her character. It actually just made things more confusing. And then you've got the even more confusing relationship between Colleen and Charles, and what influence they've had on her life. So she was fine. She didn't do a whole lot. In fact, I could argue that she did nothing, if you think about it, because she didn't kill Jason. The toxic waste did. They indirectly killed him by leading him down into the tunnel, but she didn't do anything. She didn't pull like a Ginny maneuver or a Tina maneuver or what have you. They just happened to be at the right place at the right time, or the wrong time if you're Jason. But so she doesn't really do a whole lot. She's just kind of there. She's likable. She's fine. There's nothing I dislike about her. And then Sean is equally as useless. They add this dimension of him being a frustrated son, to a disappointed father, and that didn't end up paying off. It would have been great if he was the one that navigated the boat to safety and the entire ship didn't sink and everyone didn't die. It didn't seem like he really helped in any way to get them to New York. They were just rowing blindly in the fog, and he was punching away at the computer. Didn't seem like he knew what he was doing. He certainly wasn't directing them. And they just happened to look up, and they were like...
The current took them there.
Exactly, yeah. And they see Statue of Liberty, and they're like, great. And then even then, they didn't dock at the nearest location. They went halfway around Manhattan before they docked. So he didn't do a whole lot either.
No, I mean, they could have had him, like, a great payoff for him would have been, for some reason, as if this movie needs more fucking boats, but at the end of the movie, he, pilots, like, the Staten Island ferry and manages to, like, spear Jason on the front like Jaws the Revenge or something. At least then it would have been, like, a character arc for him in some form.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, he's just a wet noodle that she's dragging around.
Yeah, neither of them get any sort of payoff or redemption for the character traits that are established early on. Like you could have had, obviously Rennie's not going to jump into the toxic waste, but maybe Sean is drowning in the sewer water or something before the toxic waste spill, and she jumps in to save Sean, and like, oh look, she's grown, she's proven that
that'd be great.
She can swim and she can save someone, and then, like you mentioned, Sean does something, where he spears Jason with the Staten Island ferry. But yeah, I just can't stand it when they introduce these like convoluted backstories that just don't pay off at all. I mean, I would argue that the most satisfying character was Julius, because they established him as a boxer and his fate was met when he boxed Jason. So it's like, it came full circle.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. Yeah, he was hands down my favorite character in this movie, and the most entertaining. And he wasn't in it enough, but when he was in it, he was great. And his death is the enduring moment from this movie for sure. I mean, she's fine. You're right. They didn't give her nearly enough to do. They kind of had this weak sauce version of Tina's premonition powers, kind of. She was a little standoffish and kind of a loner. I didn't dislike her, but she certainly isn't among the most interesting of the surviving characters in the whole series. I mean, it's another example of as when I saw this as a teenage boy, I didn't look twice at Jensen Daggett. She was kind of like, dressed like kind of a nerd, and she wasn't the type that teenage boys typically go for, but she's a total doll. And watching it this time, I'm like, oh yeah, she's a nice looking young woman, and she's grown up to look dynamite. So it's just funny how much that can change over the span of 30 years. And yeah, I mean, Sean was just kind of along for the ride. I would have loved to see him heroically sacrifice himself or something. But yeah, I mean, I much preferred, once they started introducing co-survivors, like you said, Chris was the final girl. I'm always happy that Tommy Jarvis, in whatever form he's in, survives the movie along with one other person. I liked Nick in Part 7. I thought he was good, and even though he wore too much denim, I was happy he survived. I couldn't give two shits about Sean. That's not the actor's fault. I just, he wasn't very interesting to me.
So it's never clearly established in the movie, but we are led to believe that the SS Lazarus sinks along with all of the other Lakeview High School students that were on the boat that we saw during the departure and playing, shuffleboard and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be a major tragedy for the high school. And I'm wondering how a high school would recover from something like that, where essentially the entire senior class is wiped out. The closest thing that I can compare it to was the college that I went to in the 70s. The entire basketball team went down in a plane crash. And that's obviously a hugely tragic event. But the university pays tribute to that tragedy with a big fountain in the center of campus with a memorial that has the names of everyone that perished in the plane crash. And so there's definitely an acknowledgement, and it's part of the history of the university. But then, from our high school standpoint, aside from, one or two people dying while we were in high school, there was never really some big major event that happened. And I'm just wondering what Lakeview High School is going to do to acknowledge this.
I can't help but chuckle at the idea of Lakeview High School erecting a statue of Jason in a fountain with his machete raised to the sky. Because everyone thought the senior class were a-holes. I mean, yeah, I kind of like the idea of a sequel, not, or maybe not a sequel to this movie, but take this idea and the one poor son of a bitch who didn't go on the boat trip because he couldn't afford it, or he didn't have the grades, or whatever.
Didn't do his biology project.
Didn't do his biology project, or he's a nerd, whatever. He's the only one left alive, and everybody he knows has been wiped out. And so then he's turned on to the Jason legend and begins going through the history of Jason and maybe meeting some of the previous survivors, and then undercovering history about Jason's past or something. I mean, it's just, you could kind of take it in a different direction and have Jason not necessarily be as active as a participant, but still in the mix.
So a far more interesting version of Rob from Part 4.
Yeah, right. Or at least more fleshed out.
Yeah.
That'd be kind of fun.
Or you could also twist it in the other direction and turn it into a Final Destination thing where Jason is pissed that he didn't kill all of the senior class. And so he goes out and his mission is to kill the final remaining student that was left.
That's awesome. That's much better than my survivor guilt deer hunter version of the story.
From a trivia standpoint, there's actually quite a bit to discuss. Before the idea for this movie was finalized, there was actually a few other versions floating around. There was one where John Carl Buechler, the director of New Blood, was developing a sequel that would have brought back Tina and her Tina powers following her release from an insane asylum, which is something we've heard over and over again with various characters throughout this franchise. There was also a version where Lar Park Lincoln, who played Tina, had written a screenplay which featured the return of her character, with Tina now working as a psychologist, which again sounds very familiar to some other ideas that we've heard. And then lastly, there was a script written by Kevin Spurtis, who played Nick in The New Blood, featuring Nick as the killer with the events of The New Blood being a dream, which just boggles my mind of how that even works out. So I'd kind of like to read it just to see what he was thinking, but that just sounds like the actor needing a starring role in a movie.
Yeah, I almost thought maybe that he wrote that, because I think there was a scene where Nick kills Tina, and I feel like that was at the height of his feud with Lar Park Lincoln before they made up or something, and so it was almost like wish fulfillment.
We discussed how budget restraints prohibited them from filming in New York City as much as they originally wanted to, but they did have some scenes planned that some of them sound pretty interesting. They had a quote-unquote tremendous scene on the Brooklyn Bridge, a boxing match in Madison Square Garden, which I imagine was probably the Julius scene, and maybe they just had a ring set up in Madison Square Garden to give it a bigger scope. They had a scene where Jason would go through department stores, which, you know, unless they're populated with lots of customers, I don't know how interesting that is, but I can see him, you know, hiding in racks of clothes or in the fitting room or something.
Coming out with like a flowery dress and a hat on or something.
They had a scene planned where he went into a Broadway play. And then there was lastly a scene where he would crawl to the top of the Statue of Liberty and dive off, which I desperately want to see. Especially if it's some like really graceful, you know, arms stretched out swan dive.
Right. Or the triple Lindy.
Right. Leonard Maltin called this Friday the 13th film the best in the Friday the 13th series, which is some faint praise, I suppose.
He's so unpredictable.
The original advertising for the film featured Jason ripping through an I Love New York poster, but it was dropped following a complaint from the New York Tourism Committee. But it's currently hanging in the office of my home. That
was also an instance of the MPAA, the ratings board, coming down on a poster campaign. The original version of that poster had a very bloody knife tearing through the I Heart New York poster. And the one that was eventually released and then had to be recalled because of the complaint from the tourism board was cleaned up and much less bloody.
The iconic I Love New York logo that Jason is slicing through was designed by Milton Glasser, who, at the time of this recording, passed away just less than a month ago.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
Pamela Anderson, Elizabeth Berkley, and Dee Dee Pfeiffer all auditioned for the role of Rennie before Jensen Daggett was cast, which I thought was interesting. Actor Lee Coleman was originally cast as Sean. He even shot the flooding scene with Rennie, but was replaced by Scott Reeves because producers didn't feel like he had enough chemistry with Rennie. There's also some reports that that chemistry that they're referring to was because he, quote-unquote, seemed too gay. There are some parallels between Jason Takes Manhattan and the previous film, The New Blood. Both final girls had some form of psychic powers. Both bad guys, Dr. Cruz and Charles, thought that they knew what was best for Tina or Rennie, respectively, and they were wrong. Mrs. Shepard and Colleen both played the role as protector from Dr. Cruz or Charles or Tina and Rennie. Sean and Nick were both lame boyfriends. Both had blonde mean girls, Melissa and Tamara. Both had film geeks, Eddie and Wayne. Both had missing couples, Michael and Jane from The New Blood, and Jim and Susie from Manhattan. And lastly, Jason Voorhees himself made an appearance on the Arsenio Hall show to promote the film. It's hilarious because the nearly 5-minute-long interview involves Arsenio asking Jason a number of questions, and Jason obviously just sitting there in complete silence. Taglines for this movie were, of course, I Love New York. The city that has seen it all ain't seen nothing yet.
Nice.
The biggest city in the world is about to be scared down to size. Life in the city is murder. New York has a new problem, which is my favorite. And the Big Apple's in big trouble. Jason Takes Manhattan was released on July 28th, 1989. It had a budget of $5 million, which is actually the highest total to date. It made a little over $6 million in opening weekend, but barely cracked 14 million for its total U.S. gross, which was the lowest grossing installment in the franchise so far. By the end of 1989, Jason Takes Manhattan finished in 74th place at the box office. It did beat out She's Out of Control, starring Diana Barros, who played Maddie in Part 7. Surprisingly, it also beat Always, directed by Steven Spielberg, which I always knew was a bomb, but I didn't know it was that bad of a bomb. It also beat out Dead Bang, which I own thanks to a double feature DVD I have, which also includes Action Jackson. And lastly, it beat out the fantastically named Toxic Avenger Part 3, The Last Temptation of Toxie.
This just goes to show you what a powerhouse year 1989 was for movies. I'm shocked to hear that Steven Spielberg had Always that year, because it was the same year as Last Crusade. So every once in a while he does those 1-2 punches like Jurassic Park and Schindler's List, and you know, that knocks 2 out in 1 year. That's nuts. 89 was a huge year for movies, and it was important for me because I was 15, and that was the summer of Batman, which we've talked about at great length, and it was the summer of Lethal Weapon 2, which was just like a balls-to-the-wall fun action movie that hit me at the perfect time of my life. And it was also the first summer where some of my friends had begun driving, so we were going to see a ton of movies, and I wound up seeing Lethal Weapon 2 like 5 times or something. But, this one got lost in the shuffle. I didn't see this movie until about a year later on VHS, probably because my attention was consumed elsewhere, but also maybe it wasn't in the theater long enough to see if it got pounded that hard. So, yeah, I mean, despite the fact that I was super excited to learn this movie was coming out, it was over a year before I wound up seeing it. I've since watched it quite a few times. You and I have seen it together a few times, and it's almost any Jason movie is better than no Jason movie. I can't say that's completely true, but I had fun watching it this time.
If you listened to our very special episode in June, you heard us allude to the fact that the quarantine and travel restrictions were possibly going to prevent us from getting together to record seasons of the podcast. Well, surprise, they absolutely prevented us from getting together for this season. And so we had to do it remotely. And we're going to do everything in our power to discuss the next movie, Jason Goes to Hell, in person, because there's no way we're going to be able to do that remotely. So until then, thank you for joining us for Season 8, where we've sliced and diced our way through Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Until next time, I've been your host, Brian.
I've been your co-host, Greg.
And you're all doomed.